Hi, this is Chris McKaylee, and I'm going to discuss the examination of California legislative records in this podcast. So, members of the public can examine California legislative records based upon the provisions of LORA. LORA is the acronym. It stands for the Legislative Open Records Act, which is found in the California Government Code. Distinguish this from the PRA, or the Public Records Act, that applies to other state and local entities. The legislature has its own. LORA was enacted in 1975 to allow public access to legislative records. LORA also limits the public's right to access, inspect, and copy some of these records. So, pursuant to the provisions of LORA, again in the Government Code, that members of the public can request in writing to either the Senate Committee on Rules or the Assembly Committee on Rules, depending, of course, upon which house the relevant legislative documents are in. And then the Joint Committee on Rules is charged with the custody of records that are held in the joint custody of the Assembly and Senate, such as the Joint Legislative Audit Committee, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, etc. So LORA provides the laws for review, reproduction, and access to legislative records, and has a number of specified restrictions. Generally, the two rules committees respond within 3 to 10 days upon their receipt of written requests for legislative records. Now, if a request is denied, then the individual making the request is entitled to a written explanation by the respective rules committee. Generally, the legislative records may not be removed from the office that is designated for records inspection, and the inspection generally has to occur within the presence of a designated staff member from the legislature. The public, of course, can request copies of certain records and are charged a nominal amount for the photocopying of them. There are a number of categories. In fact, there are a dozen of them in statute that are exempt from the mandatory public inspection rules under LORA. So you want to look at Government Code sections 9072 and 9075. And there are specific exceptions like correspondence between legislators and their staff, or personnel or medical records, preliminary information, records of individual names and phone numbers of folks making telephone calls, things like that. So members of the public are also allowed to gain access to other legislative documents. Government Code Section 9080 guarantees public access to committee records concerning legislation. In most instances, legislative committees have adopted written procedures concerning the public inspection of these records. Generally, interested parties have to complete a form stating specifically what legislative records they want to inspect. And if those records are not subject to inspection, then obviously they're not released. Otherwise, the committee can arrange for inspection, but the records cannot be removed from the office. And again, they're usually inspected in the presence of a committee staff members. The public can request copies be made, and again, they're charged a nominal amount to compensate for the photocopies that are being made at their request.